And of course, part one, uh, we really probably started back earlier than people thought. And my point to all that was really and truly, the experiment in self-government has always been an experiment from day one. And we saw that they didn't get it right the first time, and they completely changed, from the Articles of Confederation to a stronger union. And we did see that. So that's all good. But I'm going to ask, welcome. And can you tell me one thing that you might have learned from last week?
I have something, Russ.
Yes.
I watched you a little later on. I wasn't able to be here live last week, but in your presentation, one of the things you mentioned was that when Thomas Jefferson was dying, or sometime around that, he said that the issue about how to count slaves for the population was supposed to have been 10 years, was supposed to have been the compromise originally. And then after 10 years, it would be looked at again. But where did it say that? It didn't say that in the Constitution.
Okay. Now that's not on how to count them.
Okay,
that was what was said at the time of the Constitution. The compromise that was made was there would be no effort to shut off the importation of the slave trade.
Okay.
Until at least 10 years. And that was, I will have to check, because I was thinking it was possibly in the Constitution, but there are notes from the entire proceedings. Of course, they were all under orders that you could not take notes. And of course, Madison, the guy behind everything, took copious notes through all of it. And there is a 2-volume set of his notes, Hamilton's notes, and all the other collected notes from everybody else that did take notes there. But I will check, because I was thinking that it says right in there that it would.
Maybe it does. I didn't really look. I just never heard that before.
Yeah, no, and see, Jefferson had said it was coming to the end of his term, his second term, and he made mention of the fact that they'd banned doing anything about it before that, but they'd specifically said you cannot try to stop this until 10 years have passed, because the kind of agreement that they all had was, this is something we need to wean ourselves off of. Now, not all of the South felt that way, obviously, but enough of them did. People like Jefferson, who knew, to do this right, you are spending money on this workforce as well. And, and that it does cost. So that there was that trade-off. That was before they really thought of it as a money-making operation to buy and sell. And it's one reason why, bluntly, Jefferson and Washington both suffered, because they would keep their elder slaves and take care of them, rather than, as they're starting to age out, sell them off. So, not ideal, and one cannot make the argument that they were the most humane of anybody. But one thing I didn't say is Jefferson's last waking moment was he asked the person watching him, who happened to be a slave, to adjust his pillow. And his earliest memory as a child is being carried from one house to the next on a pillow by a slave. So here's the perfect example of a man whose entire life was encompassed by other humans that he owned, taking care of him. And there is some message in that as well, that one needs to think about. So, okay. Anybody else? Something you heard last week? Something you learned last week? We're going to go into it just a little.
You also said that.
What was that?
Russ, you also said that Jefferson was concerned that he said our sons will lose the results of our precious experiment, or something to that effect.
Yeah, he felt that when the battle over the Missouri Compromise came up, He called it a fire bell in the night. And it clearly said to him that this experiment was not going to last, that it would, that this issue would break apart the Union. And he clearly foresaw that break coming, because it became very clear that there was going to be no room for compromise, that this was not going to go away. And of course, now that the South had invested more deeply than ever, after the cotton gin, where they needed far more cotton, and to do that, they needed far more slaves to pick it, that by that time, they were addicted to slavery. And he could not see that that was ever going to change. So he knew that it would be a battle at some point. Okay. Now, things we saw was the impact that media, that what we would call communications, was starting to have. And of course, this is the picture from, a pamphlet, a handout of Jackson, the incoming president, hoisting the current president, John Quincy Adams, to hang by a noose. Now, that that's not exactly how we see the transfer of power. Ideally, in most cases, that might be closer to people saying lock them up or etc. We saw the tremendous impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin had on the entire North, how it made them more aware of the things that were happening. But of course, that was a fictionalized account, but it did make everyone in the North far more aware of possibly how, what might be a closer rendition of real life. But then again, now in our time, we would never be so foolish as to accept a fictional account to tell us what history is, right? I mean, we've never watched Gone with the Wind and thought that's how it actually worked, although I was taught in school. I swear the teacher was teaching me Gone with the Wind, not that. Certainly when I was in grade school, it was very clear that my teachers had been highly impacted by Birth of a Nation. I mean, some of the things they were telling me was straight out of that. So, again, fictionalized accounts can become part of our story, and a good one can make us more aware. A bad one can lead us in the wrong direction. And of course, the more communication and the more these pamphlets, and I said broadsides, were coming out, a lot of these things are happening. News reaches further and faster at the same time. And of course, here we have, the caning of Sumner in the Senate. But then we also talked about, what had happened with the Supreme Court and Taney's decision on Dred Scott, which I said is listed as one of the 2 worst decisions ever by the Supreme Court. But here's the thing I did not say last time. I'd mentioned to you that he had written right in that ruling that the black man has no rights that the whites are obligated to observe. He wrote that right in there. But, what I didn't ask, and what we must keep in mind here, is really, if you look at that, did he find that statement in law somewhere? Is that anywhere in the concept of all men are created equal? Is that listed in any of the rulings? Because remember, the Dred Scott ruling was far, far before we had legalized the concept of separate but equal as well. So, on the question as to whether he was actually writing a law or giving his opinion, that was clearly opinion. There was no law to back up that line. But I said at the same time, he then went further and blew up the Missouri Compromise, and thus bringing on, in many ways, moving the Civil War that one step closer, and really that was the step almost to the precipice. And then, of course, by the same, Jackson in history, the man on the horse that all of the original founding fathers had said they'd always have to worry about, here it's Jackson that expanded the suffrage to more voters, which is a good idea. But of course, they were voters that agreed with his ideals and his items. And, he built a party around his personality and his likes. That party was not founded on any political principle. He might have said it was for greater suffrage, more people voting. But really, if you look at it, he was a rich landowner and he hated the bank. Thus, he opposed it. He'd been an Indian fighter all his life and he hated Indians and he ignored their rights that their treaties gave them. And, as a popular favorite, he then ignored any of the idea that the laws or the Constitution applied to him. This was not based around political principle. And the biggest point that I made last time, and we have to be aware of this, it's Jackson that brought more power to the president. Prior to that point, it's well recognized. The executive officer's idea was he's there to make sure things move along. But laws and ideas of laws come from the Congress and specifically from the House of Representatives. Remember, it's the House of Representatives that's supposed to come up with what the budget is, that all spending bills are supposed to originate in the House. These were people who had come out of the colonial experience where they had a legislative body that controlled their colony with the approval of, quote unquote, the Home Office, the British. So we need to realize what we saw last time. And this is the point I'm getting to that we don't want to forget. What I pointed out was these problems came on when politicians could not solve the problem, because we've made politics a dirty word, and politics is the effort to get things done, to find agreement between groups who are not necessarily in agreement. So when politicians could not solve problems, what we saw was that the people lost faith in the system. It's not solving my problem. And it's not coming close to solving my problem. Why should I believe it? And thus, when that happens and happens repeatedly, we will see that we try to create a new way to deal with our problems. And that, if you think about it in terms of our own time, we rely less and less on Congress because they have rigidly locked themselves into situations, and they will often boot the problem up to the president, and then they're free to either agree or disagree with it, but not in taking ownership of it. So the real problem with the fact that we try to create a new way to deal with our problems, quite often what we're saying is we want any result. We got to move off dead center. And thus we're not saying good results. And this is where that fear of there are people who will just suddenly ascribe to the idea of the strong man theory, the person who gets things done. And thus, after World War II, after World War I, in Germany, in Italy, in other countries, you saw the idea of, well, we've been at a deadlock, just find somebody strong to move it forward. And we still see that today. There are people who lean toward that concept that, oh, I like a strong leader, rather than saying, let's find a way through this. So remember, you always got to worry about what you wish for because you might get it. And what we also saw last week is that ignoring the other side by creating policies that will diminish the other side's standing as a person, which is what was actually happening with the Dred Scott case, right? Or if you diminish the ideas or ideals that the other side holds, as you might with, in this time period, that were going to be studying all the immigrants coming in and things like that. Well, they're not on the same level as us, or they're not as developed as we are. Once you do that, you're diminishing the other person's standing as a person on their right to have an opinion that you should respect. And that leads to eventual problems within the system. And when politics don't work, leadership breaks down. And what we saw before the Civil War is when that happens, when you can't get agreement at a farther out, you pull it down until you get to the point that it meshes with what you can find agreement on. So in other words, in your local area. And that's one of the reasons, one of the points I made last time was that, the Civil War is the only time that we saw it all go to a shooting war. And much of that was due to regionalism. The people were grouped together that believed the way they did. Although, really and truly, think about this, were there people in the North that equally did not want to go to war, or equally did not care to have Negroes moving north? No, yes, there were. And were there people in the South who really didn't want to have slaves? In fact, not everybody in the South was a slave owner, and very few were. And that's just a reality. But they were stuck with those people who were driving the bus down there, right? So one of the things I'd said that we saw last week, when we're looking for commonalities, an increasing population base, an expanding ability to communicate, but at the same time, an increase in disinformation, differences of opinion that are not engaged and weighed, but instead savaged by the other side, all of which leads to a lack of respect for the opinion of others. And once you have that, you have problems. As I said, it's the only time in this country that we progress to a shooting war, and that's due to that regionalism. And to drive that home, I guess I'd like to make a point. Yes, in the South, after Lincoln was elected, you had all these constitutional conventions in these states, and they chose and decided, not all of them, some of the border states stayed, but most of them all said, yes, we're withdrawing from this union. We've made that decision. But remember, who actually made the decision to fire on the federal Fort Sumter, in the Bay? It was all of those people who were looking for, oh, there's going to be excitement, there's going to be a fight, there's going to be everything. Remember, they'd been ringed by, the militia had come in, the different troops had come in, but the order, it was actually the people pushing for that fight. It is we, the people, that take on these decisions. The Confederacy itself did not necessarily make that decision. So again, remember the concept of this class, the American experiment in self-government has frequently been in trouble, but what we're looking for here is what causes these troubles and how did we avoid destruction. Now, the Civil War was the one time that we did not avoid destruction, but we've had lots of others. And tonight we're going to be looking at an issue that is not regional, although it will end up having regional side effects. So if you're ready, here, just a prologue. In about February of 1886, Jay Gould's Union Pacific Railroad was struck by the people who worked on it. And, in doing so, in trying to prevent these trains from moving to try to cause the Union Pacific difficulty, they were trying to get into the yards and shut off the boilers to dampen the fire. Because if you cool those engines, it takes about 6 hours for a cold engine to build up enough steam to haul freight. And the point being that this would cause them embarrassment, this would cause them trouble, this would cause them great difficulty. But in trying to get into a yard, a switcher and a independent, say somebody like a Pinkerton agent, would fire on strikers entering the yard, killing one of them, and thus people, on both sides were incented to be angry. There was a great deal of effort in what was happening. Then the strikers became more violent toward toward destruction of property. And in doing so, what really happens is, and you see this in all the strikes, when there's destruction of property, those people sitting on the sidelines, the people just reading the news, the people you need to kind of support you, once you start destroying property, they kind of back off and say, oh, this isn't right. You shouldn't do this. And thus the strike will unravel. It will not be observed by the rest of the people who kind of make that decision. Oh, we're not going to use that train. We're not going to use that agency. And you got to remember, Jay Gould was hated. Nobody liked him. Nobody ever liked him. Nobody ever would like him. But here he's winning the public opinion war. So that was brought on by the Knights of Labor, which was a very interesting labor organization on multiple levels. Remember, this is 1886. The Knights of Labor would accept you if you were a white worker, a black worker, a alien worker, or anybody else. And they would accept you into their ranks if you were a woman. These are all things that were unheard of at that time. But the problem is they've started to lose strength because they're not able to successfully successfully actually do this, to pull off this strike. And on May 1st, which of course is May Day, the international day for labor at that time, 13,000 industrial workers across the US will go on strike. And their demands are absolutely outrageous. They want a safer workplace, they want higher wages, and they want an 8-hour workday. Well, now, how are we ever going to make money in just 8 hours? Now, the big point to this is, while the 13,000 actually officially go on strike, it's another 350,000 other workers will walk off the job that day in support. That's a lot of people. And remember, that trying to sell everybody on the idea of 8 hours, the 8 hours to work, 8 hours to rest, 8 hours to do what we want. Well, that's unheard of. Nobody has that deal. But we need to remember, don't think of this as free time. That 350,000 people had a great reason to be involved and reason to worry. Because at that time, on the injury rates, if you worked in a normal mine, if you were a miner, probably 3 out of 1,000 people would die. So if you had 1,000 workers in a mine, on an average, you'd have 3 of them die of an industrial accident over the coming year. But if you had 5,000, then that's 15. Well, what's an acceptable number? Well, one thing we got to remember is that if you worked in the railroad, that number is 10, not 3, 10 will die. So, and that's just conservatively listed for this era. And remember, there are more than just the jobs within the railroad that they were tracking here. But really, out of that 350,000, you could possibly be talking 5 to 7,000 that might end up dead within that coming year. And we always have to remember, for all the ones who die, there are those many, many more that are just disabled and will never work again. And why is that? Why is that happening? The U.S. workplace is very dangerous because by the 1880s, all these labor-saving machines were in the workplace, and there's absolutely no legal or regulatory protection for any of those. And that's bad enough if you're in a steel mill, and that's bad enough if you're in a mine, but it is far, far worse if you're in an area like the railroad where there's a lot of literally rolling stock, and you're doing it at night in the dark, and maybe after you've already worked 12 hours, and you've worked for the last 14 days straight. Now, why is this happening? Because accidents that damaged replaceable workers, these are production accidents, were cheap to the industry. It really cost them nothing. There's somebody else waiting for that job. There's no law that says you have to compensate that person. At the very most, they might feel nice enough to give them the check for the whole week, even though they didn't work the whole week because they, well, fell down and died. But, that is amazing. And here's the other part that you have to think about that we never talk about. This is the go-go era of the Gilded Age in America. These numbers are twice what they are in England at this time. England, because of their more regulatory nature, does not have the high numbers that America does. So now the issue is that the strike has been called, and there's already a strike in place in Chicago at the McCormick Reaper Works. And the unarmed strikers there end up, they say, clashing with police. Of course, they're jeering John, and everything else with them. And the police that were called in to break up the protest fired on the strikers. And remember, police, as always in these cases, are brought in on the side of the factory owner. And as that always happens, then violence will break out. And in almost all cases, it's workers that are killed. It's the workers that came to a gun battle generally with a brick, not a gun. And thus you end up in the situation where almost all of these casualties end up being among the workforce. And again, the people in America accept that because, well, they're trying to interfere with free trade. They're trying to interfere with personal property, the factory owner's property. So now many, I think it's 29 are wounded, but 6 workers are outright killed. And thus on the next day, there's going to be a meeting at the Haymarket in Chicago. And of course, Chicago is truly that melting pot where you have massive numbers of immigrants that are working there in jobs like these. And many of them bring with them the idea of trade unionism. They're not strangers to unions, and they're not strangers to combat about jobs, about fighting for their jobs and their rights. A mass meeting is called for 7:30 p.m. at the Haymarket, and people are outraged. And notice, good speakers will be present to denounce the latest atrocious act of police, the shooting of our fellow workmen yesterday afternoon. It is a hot button moment, and it is a moment of highly emotional outpouring. By the way, this is the top of that meeting list, meeting pamphlet. It's written in 2 other languages underneath. One's in German, and I think the other's in Polish under here, just to make sure they get, a good assortment of people. And they do. They have a good turnout. And it goes peacefully until 9 o'clock. There's a light rain falling, and they're starting to break up. The main speakers have spoken. And at about that time, 150 police storm the area to break it up and to roust everybody out of there. And at that moment, a sputtering fuse attached to something comes over the top of the crowd and lands among the policemen, and the bomb explodes. Newspapers the next day would call it a hellish deed. The dynamite bomb thrown into a crowd of policemen explodes, covers the streets with dead and mutilated officers. Now, newspapers as always side with the police, though the deaths are about equal on both sides because the police had already started firing. Most of the dead are not from the explosion. Many of the police that are dead are from friendly fire. But this time the crowd had brought their weapons, knowing that they'd been fired on at the McCormick spot. They brought guns. So now you've got the situation where you have a very volatile moment in time. But it will continue to spread. The violence will spread through to Polish workers on the mills in Milwaukee, just north of Chicago. Again, 6 more striker deaths as the police militia just immediately fire upon the marchers. But the big issue is the use of dynamite. And remember, prior to this, you did not have all that much dynamite happening because dynamite didn't exist. If you were going to throw a bomb, it was a much more difficult issue because you had nitroglycerin, which was far, far more dangerous to work with, and definitely volatile. You could end up blowing yourself up. But with the advent of dynamite, now there is this item, and anarchists. And who are anarchists? The claim, of course, is an anarchist is someone who wants no hierarchy, no people, but anybody that happens to be generally of a different nationality coming over from Europe that might have been in unions over there, that might have been involved in some of the battles that went so badly that they were blowing each other up, even with the old round bombs with the fuse in them that you saw. Those are not really cartoons. That is what they used to use when it was nitroglycerin. Anybody that might be a dangerous person was just labeled an anarchist, but many were anarchists. They had come to believe that the process was not going to work for them. And we're going to meet a number of anarchists in this program. It's the use of dynamite on police that galvanizes everybody into action. People in general are outraged, and massive roundup of radicals immediately follow. Any radicals, the agitators, and of course those labor leaders are considered anarchists and they're considered agitators. And of course, all the people speaking that night at that meeting had been agitators. They were agitating the crowd to say, we need to strike, we need to strike back, we need to need to organize and have them meet our needs. Within 2 days, 50 different meeting places have been raided. Labor and socialist press offices are closed by decree. 37 people are arrested. Almost all of them are of non-American extract. They are immigrants. 8 are brought to trial for murder. Actually, to start with, 7, all of them immigrants. Many of them speakers that night at the meeting, even though no one believes that any of the speakers actually threw the bomb. The issue is this is going to stifle all strikes that are in process. So it has, a benefit to all of the businesses that have been fighting strike results, trying to continue to do business as normal, which might mean, what's an acceptable loss in workers? One of the most noted was Albert Parsons, a great labor agitator. He claimed it outright. He would travel around the country to speak, and he was one of the speakers that night at the event when the bomb was thrown. He had spoken earlier along with can't remember his first name, Spies, that 2 of the biggest names. And they'd been backed by the Knights of Labor. And again, this is going to be the end for the Knights of Labor. Between the failed strike earlier that year, then this mess, it's just not going to happen. And a lot of the leadership is going to be dismantled as well. Now, I'd said that 7 were arrested. Albert Parsons showed up. Albert Parsons had not been arrested. He knew when the bomb went off, oh my gosh, they'll be looking for me. I've got to get out of here. And he'd left town. But when he saw all of his friends arrested, and he knew they'd been arrested because, unlike him, they were foreign born, he showed back up and turned himself in. And in doing so, he would speak out. He saw it as using the platform as a chance to wake Americans up to what's happening. And especially in this case, where he could see that it was going to be probably a miscarriage of justice. And he would say to the judge, after they were all sentenced to hang, Your Honor, I hold that our execution is judicial murder. Now, meaning he came back knowing that he, Spies, and all the others probably would die. And all of these men were uninvolved. They claimed we had nothing to do with anyone throwing a bomb. But the problem was with the public, they were unapologetic. They understood that the police had been there to roust them, to bust heads, and to fire on the crowd, which they did. And they're not apologetic. He turned himself in to be tried and to become a martyr for the cause. Now, he's a confusing man anyway. It was an abolitionist that would become a Confederate soldier. He married a former slave, and he finally ends up as a radical Republican before he becomes an anarchist. Go figure. Don't even try. But he was a powerful speaker, and during that trial, he would speak out and be heard, but not for long. The trial comes a scant 6 weeks after the bombing. And of all of these 8 that are gathered together, all had alibis. None could be connected to the crime, but they were all found guilty as accessories by their inflammatory speeches. I'm not sure about this. You may disagree with me, but I did believe, and I could be wrong, that speech was protected in America. Not positive. Not one of their speeches that night had anything to do with saying pick up a bomb and kill policemen. They did not. But the problem is many anarchists would write things like that in essays and in the papers that they are all dealing with. And remember, it's papers that are largely the way they disseminate their information. Now, of those 8, of the 8, the 4 would die immediately. After being convicted, they would have a chance at a many of the others would go ahead and appeal, but these guys said, you intend to kill us anyway. They intended to be martyrs. Of the 8, one of them killed himself, committed suicide in prison. And all of them agreed they were guilty of exercising free speech. Now, here is what the prosecuting attorney said. Law is on trial. Anarchy is on trial. Convict these men and you will save our institutions. We actually hear things like that today, don't we? But that's so bold, saying you've got to sacrifice these guys even if they really aren't guilty of killing anybody. Now, 4 would hang, and in fact, Albert would try to speak. Notice they've got hoods over them and everything else. Albert would try to speak, saying, may I have time for just a few last words? And they dropped the trapdoor under him. And worse yet, 2 that appealed would have their sentences commuted to life in prison. And the other one, that leaves 1 out of them. He had thrown himself on the mercy of the court, apologized, said again he had nothing to do with it, but he accepted responsibility because he did all the things, he said all the things they wanted to hear, and they'd sentenced him to 15 years. Now, in 1893, the remaining 3 that were still in prison for life in prison would be pardoned. Of course, Albert Parsons, August Spies, Albert Fisher, Adolf Fisher, George Engel, they'd all been hanged. You can't pardon them. They're not coming back. And they'd done it to be accepted as martyrs. And in reality, that kind of worked because they were part of a group. The one issue about the anarchists, they had come to decide that the system was not going to work, that the system would never provide a safe working environment for people. And that radicalization would happen, and one of them, a woman, would become known as the anarchist queen. She would continue to advocate for more radical tactics. She would continue to push, and really it is her gender that keeps her alive. She was originally arrested in this, but they were not going to try to hang a woman. and they wanted the death penalty, and they purposely let her go, she would spend the rest of her life, and she would live quite a long life, to go on and constantly throw in their faces, the evil that they had done, but still fighting the system. We talk about radicalization all the time today, and that is what these guys had hoped. There was a man named, he wanted to say Albert Moist, but that's not it. But he was of the belief that the only way change was going to come was, just as we have that great man theory that arises once in a while, he had the theory that you kill the great man and things will change. He definitely was truly an anarchist. And one of the people that came under his sway, who was radicalized by the clearly unfair treatment of these men in this hanging, was this woman, Emma Goldman. She was outraged by the injustice, and her conversion and her efforts she would be again heard and on the scene for many, many years. Now, we know that the Haymarket was a gross error in injustice, but it would inspire and repeat a cycle of fear and response. We are going to see this method in strikes for many decades to come, because remember, the way the laws are all written now, they work at the now being the 1880s. People have no rights. The owners have all the rights. And during this time period, remember, things are proceeding. We've got the second industrial revolution. We've got railroads uniting the country. In our days, we talk about the service industry. Well, here we're seeing the beginning of the merchandising industry. And in that, I want you to notice Singer and Carnegie. Well, we know who Carnegie is, right? If you're going to build railroads across the country, you probably need steel for those rails. And Carnegie has figured out how to make steel as fast as possible, faster than anyone could imagine, etc. But who's Singer? That's Singer sewing machine. Why is that important? Because at the same time, the second industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution is just adding steam and thus power that is not just manpower. Remember, the other part of that revolution is mass production of items, but that includes now gears and items that are interchangeable. The Singer sewing machine becomes possible because they finally work to the point where all of those parts have a tolerance, so they work together. The other item, the item that probably comes along about the same time and was easier to do, was the bicycle. Interchangeable parts. You could create each of them, the gears and the chains and the hubs and everything else, and it all works. That's the piece of this. And of course, with Rockefeller, we talked about the rise of the captains of industry, or the robber barons, depending on how you view them. Notice we've got the Edisons, the Fords, the people who are thinking, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, who are out there thinking of new ways to do things, but they're not thinking of new ways to be nicer to workers. Although Carnegie, as we will see, was pretty decent to his workers. Now, the point I'm making here is demands of business on government changed completely after the Civil War. And here I've been saying that here all this time, the whole point of the Constitution is to protect contractual law, to protect property owners, because that's really what it is. It is to be able to have an environment so that you can contract to do work for, or work with, or make sales, and be certain there is a body of laws to help you get your money. But other than that, remember, business had always said government has no part of the business world. We are separate. We stand aside. You are there to manage things, but not us. Well, that changes after the Civil War, doesn't it? Because while they've always contended government has no place in business, funny, after the Civil War, it's the American public that finances the railroads. And remember, to start with, there's no money involved. They're just exchanging land. And of course, all that land to the west of where civilization is public ground. So they're able to trade it. And for every mile you build, you get, a section of a mile on each side of the track in alternating squares so you can sell them. But they kind of gloss over the fact that really there's also bonds from the government. They're providing the financing, they're providing bonds, and for every mile they lay, there's a bonus in the give back on the bonds. So by 1870, the American public is really underwriting those railroads. It's one of the reasons railroads are becoming so big, but it also is doing great things for the country. So there's a reason to do this, but there's also large amounts of cash flowing past individual, which means there's lots of room for graft, right? But throughout all this, we've got the rapid growth of industry because factories have become the new way of life. What did they replace? They replaced Jefferson's idea of the independent farmer, the agrarian businessman who's totally self-sufficient, grows everything he needs, sells a little bit to have some money, but really and truly he is totally comfortable on his land, making all his own food, making all his own clothes, doing everything for himself. But it also displaced the in-between factor, the idea of the journeyman apprentice, coming to somebody who knew a skill in building harnesses or in building horseshoes or in doing brickwork or anything like that. You would apprentice yourself to that person, you would learn the skill, and as the person grew older and as you learned the skills, you would come up and possibly work in the same area or go to a different area so that you're not competing with them, but you would become an artisan, you would step forward. All of that is totally replaced by the rapid growth of industry, of everybody doing similar work in a factory. And thus the factory's only obligation is to give you a place to do that work and pay you a paycheck. But remember, those factories need many, many people, and that's why we see American immigration just explode at this point. Also by the fact that, of course, there are bad things and shortages and crop failures in Europe, and all of those things are pushing people this way, and we're pulling them this way because there are jobs and there is land and there are possibilities. We have unbridled immigration, and it's flowing toward America. And, between 1880 and 1896, the growth of business power and the trusts have meant that they've actually outstripped what the trade unions can do to try to say, no, you have to work with us. We have to get a living wage. No, you're no longer in a trade union. We're no longer just creating one item. You're working in a factory. But even that withheld, there are the lawless strikes, because remember, the government does not recognize necessarily the right to strike, and definitely does not recognize the right to prevent people from coming on to the property you have struck, to keep workers from crossing your picket line. So government is constantly, regularly entering on the owner's side. And here's the point. These are issues that are economical. They're not political. The political party is completely handicapped, because even trying to fix this, it's off limits, because we've said we have built into our DNA the idea that government has no business regulating business. And at that same time, oil, iron, steel, railroads, food production, meat packing, even here in Sioux City, all of those are exploding, and they're doing so by growing huge. They get the economies of scale that allow them extreme savings and mighty profits. And remember what Rockefeller had said, what he had decided? Hey, it's my right to be able to try to become so big that all of the other refineries have to do it my way, i.e. they're going to work for me, or I'll just squeeze them out of business, which he did, and probably did anyway. So the issue in the second half of the century was the refusal to consider any aspect of business being under the realm of government. Governments saw themselves as the protectors of business, and much of that, of course, was because the businesses had more input and spoke in a unified manner for what they wanted. It's the change of the scale, the move to workers rather than craftsmen, and thus the loss of wages and earnings. And when you lose those things, you're also losing freedom. We'd said that before the Civil War, the issue was the refusal to address the real problem, which was slavery. And in the second half of the century, it's the refusal to consider any aspect of business regulation. And that won't come until late. We see that very late, possibly even into the 20th century before that's going to happen. It is entirely upon the owner to choose to be benevolent. I try to, we've heard some of the words from different people in this. I want to make sure they're being heard. This is one of my favorite ones, Andrew Carnegie. The greatest astonishment of my life was the discovery that the man who does the work is not the man who gets rich. How amazing. What a concept. And he's recognizing it. And because of that, Carnegie, somebody who had come up from the bottom and used his smarts and his intelligence to get to the top, is pretty fair to his people, as fair as anyone can be at that time, but not on the issues of danger, not on the issues of a safe workplace, but definitely he is better about the financial end of it. He's not great. You're not going to get rich, but you shouldn't starve if you're working for him. But things happen, right? So in that Gilded Age, we looked at this picture once before. It's Rockefeller who had become so huge. See all the oil wells out there and the refinery smokestacks all surrounding the Capitol. Looking at it going, gee, what a funny little government you have here. As I said, he'd recognized the concept, get bigger and force all the other refineries to follow his lead. But in honesty, he also realized that get bigger and force the government to follow your lead. Remember, we have to strip out the mindset we have today. It was not big government back then. There was very little big government. Government only met for so many months a year. They closed down during the heat of the summer. They didn't feel a need to be there all the time. And the laws that were passed were laws that were agitated by the businesses. Now, sometimes by people, but the laws allowed businesses to create excessive money. That's really what it comes down to. And the money allowed the businesses to influence, we'll use that word, influence the legislatures. Remember, this was a time when it was not an unknown deal to enter Congress and on your desk in Congress, because you didn't, unlike today, you didn't spend your entire time in your office. You were expected to show up on the floor and hear what other people said, because that was your job. You'd get there, and on your desk, there might be this wonderful bouquet of flowers that happened to be in this beautiful vase that might happen to be wrapped with stock from what railroad or whatever, based on the way you voted the night before. You have to realize that because of that, the legislature could not address the core problem of the time, which was capital versus labor. I try to use pictures of the time, and here we see the bosses of the Senate, the Steel Beam Trust, the Mail Trust, the Copper Trust, the Standard Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, the Sugar Trust, all of these massive influences. This is the Senate. This is the place the monopolizers by the monopolizers for the monopolizers is what the sign says. The people's entrance is up top, and notice it's closed. The point is, people were aware that, business spoke and was heard. And thus what happened is, because of that, all of the issues end up revolving around things that are not going to improve really the working man's life. They might improve things a little bit. And one of those, that's why we suddenly started hearing about silver instead of the gold standard and things like that. Big thing that the businesses wanted to make sure of is that it stayed hard money. What's that mean? That there was something to back that money up, because once you go away from that, it's felt it's going to be inflationary, and inflationary means the money that the businesses are making is not worth as much as it had been that morning. The other point was protectionism. How should you use tariffs? Not should we use them, but how high can they be to protect our businesses? But there is a certain amount of regionalism, even though it's past the Civil War. There's a certain amount of regionalism because the West is not like the East. And fiscal policy divides the country. All those people in the cities, and more people are moving to the cities because that's where the jobs are. The people in the cities want cheap goods. The rural farmers want some help against the railroad. They want some assistance in having enough money to buy the things they need. Businesses want protection, which are tariffs, which will hurt the people in the cities and in the rural area, but they hurt the rural area far more. Tariffs only increase the cost for the public, but they sound good to everyone who isn't thinking about the results. And some guy named McKinley will pass the McKinley Tariff Act, which will jack those rates up so high that at the same time, they completely ignore what the trusts and the others are doing. Thus, it's the laborer that has absolutely no access to cash, to help, to anything else. Here lies prosperity, enslaved in 1863, stabbed in the back in 1873, and assassinated in 1893 by John Sherman, Grover Cleveland, and other traitors in Congress, because they had just passed on, interest-bearing bonds, which that interest then, works against the common man. Again, the true fixes are not in anybody's playbook. Neither side, neither party is going to consider the real changes that are needed to fix the issues. And thus, they're constantly playing on the margins and constantly frustrating the working man. And remember what I said, this is that era when, because the farms are staying, you don't make an income on farm, you make a living. And because of the tariffs, you may not even be able to sell your excess if you've started to grow excess. In 1820, only 1 in 20, 5% of the American public lives in cities. By 1890, 1 out of 2.5 live in cities. It's a lot of people. And that concentration of people and the difference between the way people in the rural areas perceive people in the cities is a big deal, and it's going to just continue to get worse. And remember, one of the reasons for that perception is because where do all the immigrants end up settling? They end up settling in the city. This is Ellis Island. You probably recognize it. But what you see is, that influx of people coming in and that distrust, because, of course, they are not steeped in the American values the way we think people should be. But remember, when immigrants come into the city, they're befriended by groups, and those groups are actually political machines. They will find them jobs. They might not be the best jobs, but they're a job, but they do it in exchange for them voting the way they want it. It makes, they call these machines because it just constantly turns out the voters to vote the way they want. And it makes the machines and their leaders rich, but it really doesn't do that much for the immigrants. Remember, we still in industrialization, we need workers, and child labor is even better because the kids don't argue. They're used to taking orders from their parents. This era of industrialization, we are doubling the sizes of these cities: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, double in size. They become huge. And what's that mean? You have slums, you have child labor, you have different cultures that do not trust each other, and none of them are trusted by the dominant white culture. Growth of industry, business is bigger. Average people no longer start major businesses. Average people can only go to work for them. And again, that's also why most of the ships with immigrants do not end up in the South, because they already have sharecroppers. They already have their labor force sorted out the way they want it. They don't really have factories at this point. You're going north. And remember, in those bigger businesses, the boss is no longer one of the crew. It's not like when you were working as an apprentice, you might not even know the boss. And definitely the person overseeing you is only interested in how much work you can turn out, not how safely you can work. And with no government oversight, 7-day work weeks is not unusual. Job injuries and deaths are the norm. And as I said, slums that nobody likes. And remember, everybody's leaving the farm because while, you're not going to get rich working in the factory, you're not going to starve, most likely, if enough of you can work. And the non-farm wage is constantly going up, whereas the farm wage isn't. They're working to pull people from the farms, and they do. But the storm clouds that we saw at the Haymarket will continue. Antitrust labor laws that finally get passed are not used against the businesses. They're used against labor. And with no relief in the courts, socialism is gaining. The people are starting to go, well, what choice is there? The appeal to reason, what choice is there? We're not getting anywhere. How can a different option be bad? Now, as we watch this shift in power, we're starting to see the rise of powerful men. I already talked about those machines in the cities. Boss Tweed, is a perfect example. And I talked about how under Jackson, we saw that the president can be more powerful than he was, but really the most powerful man in the country is going to be the Speaker of the House. But the problem is that's like herding cats, and it takes somebody special to be able to do that. What we're going to see at this time period is how somebody who can master that, we're going to start seeing how that will translate into the presidency as well. Government doing the work of businesses is going to take its toll during this time period. People are against the wall. And once you get people backed up against the wall, there will be repercussions and people will make a change. But Congress isn't listening. Now, we'd talked about Grover Cleveland in previous classes. He's the first president who says, he lost his job at his first reelection, and he realized it's because he just did what was right. He didn't pay attention to his base, is what we'd say today. And thus, he becomes truly the leader of his party. And in doing so, he's the only one that would aspire to do that for quite some time. And he only did it in his second term because he realized to have power, to be able to do the things he wanted to do, he had to do that. At the same time, we're seeing the Speaker of the House, which is rife. The House is rife with greed. I said there's so much money going past. The corruption is everywhere. But they at least manage to find a way to do business most of the time, but they're starting to have their fights. Thomas Reed of Maine comes along and takes control. And in doing so, he will actually take control and become very rich doing so, because one of the things he's going to make sure of is he's going to take care of those railroads, and the railroads will definitely take care of him. He is one of the first great masters of the House, and he does so by completely tearing up the rules, deciding how to determine a quorum, and then he locks the doors with everybody in there and fights with them for 3 days. And when it's over, they've agreed to his terms and on how to conduct business. And what that really means is he decides all the business that will be conducted and can choose when and how much. And everybody's going to get rich, but he's going to get richer. You know, his control was so complete that they would pass more bills than they had passed in the last decade. They pass 611 bills. They admit all these states because, of course, that works for the railroads. And, you know, they continue spending money like it's water. He's taunted by outraged citizens that the budget has somehow surpassed $1 billion for the first time. How can you do that? Well, mostly they're doing it to help businesses create the businesses so they can get the money from it. His response, it's $1 billion country. He just shrugs it off. The improvements, though, he does pass a number of things that Cleveland's trying to put through, things that are good, but they are minor compared to all the things business is getting. Now, why is it they're able to do this? Isn't there a constitution that prevents all of these excesses, all of these problems? Well, we have to remember that in the aftermath of the Civil War, we had all these amendments come through, many of them to guarantee the rights of slaves. Ironically, they would not be used to guarantee the rights of slaves. They would introduce this new concept that the state cannot take anything from any person. They cannot take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And what the Supreme Court suddenly realizes is, well, what's that mean? That means that we can take things from people with due process. So on individuals, as long as we follow due process, we can take away your rights. But for businesses, we can thwart any laws that do make it through the legislature, or worse, they don't make it through the legislature. They make it through individual states, which are much more responsive to regulate those businesses. They start to decide they have the right to overrule state laws that are no longer meeting the requirements of union. Something we live with every day, but we don't think about it. The problem is they were using the due process of law concept. You know, how was the law made? Did it follow proper procedures? If so, the law stood, and if not, the court could say, no, you've got to redo that because it doesn't. So key issue of that, the guy who came up with this, Justice Stephen Field, lost the first time he made these arguments, but that was the last time he'd lose because all his buddies on the court are all ex-corporate lawyers. And they would suddenly use this due process wedge to stop states from abridging the freedom of contracts and the liberty of enterprise. That's how all of this happens. That's why the last half of the 19th century is nothing but friendly to business. You know, the Supreme Court had gathered a previously unidentified power to itself, you know, the right to decide what was and was not constitutional, and then to be able to tell state governments that they're doing it wrong, not federal, state laws. Now, because the concept of the Constitution was to prevent government from taking too much from the individual, you know, this is a good thing, except the problem is businesses as corporations are considered almost individuals, and the rights of those businesses always during the Gilded Age would outweigh any individual interest. Ruling after ruling comes down, strikes, you know, it strikes down state regulations of railroad rates. You cannot tell them how much they can, you know, what's an unfair rate. They rule that the Sherman Antitrust Act is illegal. They rule that Lochner versus New York, that's the first time a state, and it's New York, had come up with a law restricting the maximum hours for workers. And they did that based on gender, by the way. They had said, these women should be able to bear children, and you can't have them working 14 hours a day and think this is going to be a good thing. So they had restricted women to a maximum number of hours, and they said, no, you can't do that. It will take another 15 to 20 years before these are overridden and do become powers. But as in any case in our history, when the pendulum swings too far one way, when big business or big government or any other group abuses its power, grassroots will rise up. People will finally reach that point where they cannot stand it any longer. And those organizations will push for regulations and reform. And as the economic woes worsen, and boy, they are going to turn very bad very quickly. In this case, a shared crisis of a recession is going to unite people to demand legislation for change. And one of those recessions is the 1890s recession. And what it does is it creates a situation that was unheard of. Black and white sharecroppers, both North and South, will join forces, and Western and Northern farmers are going to come together on common ground on these issues because they're dying. It's deflation. The entire recession has caused things to be worth less, and the court is allowing nothing to protect anyone, and these folks are up in arms, and they're demanding their local governments, their state governments do something about it, and they're getting attention. Now, the first thing they're going to do is they just break away from the concept of the established Republican and Democratic parties. And to take back control, they have all come together as the People's Party. And their first convention is going to be in Omaha in 1892. That's kind of cool, isn't it? And they have a platform, things that they say they believe in, and they mean it. And their platform for the Populist Party is election of senators. Remember, at this point, they're, in the Constitution, it says state legislators appoint the senators. That was part of that deal that Franklin had come up with to make sure the states are protected. You didn't turn that over to the people. You turned that over to the state to decide who's going to be there to represent them in the Senate. Well, now they're saying there should be actual election of senators, not through the state legislature. There should be a graduated income tax. These guys are getting so wealthy. The separation between of income is so great. It is greater than any time has ever been in the history of America, including up to today. They're saying there should be a graduated income tax. So people who make more should pay more. And there should be recall elections. If we elect somebody and find out that they're not doing what they said they were going to do, we should be able to recall them. And of course, they're anti-immigration. They want to shut that down so that laborers become more valuable, right? And all this, as long as we're shooting for it, let's shoot for the moon, an 8-hour workday. What a concept. Now, the Socialist Party has had that as a plank in their party all along, but now you're starting to see even a full party that's not socialist recognizing an 8-hour workday has merits. Now, here's the scary part. They win 1 million votes. They win 4 full states. The rural West is for them. And in doing so, they scare the other parties. Part of this is, of course, because of the Depression. Now, remember as well, they had helped split that vote, so it does put it does put Grover Cleveland back in the White House. Now, he comes along just in time. Remember, I said that we're doing nothing for the economy. And thus we end up with the economy in free fall. And the Depression of 1893 is going to last 4 years. It's going to be one of the worst depressions ever, almost as bad as the Great Depression. And it displaces roughly 20% of the nation's workforce. When I say displace, what's that mean? They have no jobs, they have no way to make income, and they've got to go somewhere to find it. They are displaced. They're out of jobs and have to find something. Now, at the same time, we've got then strikes as people are trying to say, we need more money. And thus you have the Homestead strike, which is that strike against Carnegie. And that's going to be an important item. Then we'll see these others as well. It's the rise of populism. As I said, economic distress, 20% of the nation's workforce. Anytime you get something that big, it's going to be bad. And what we will see, for the first time, people realize there is nothing to eat. There's nowhere to get money. There is nothing locally you can do. And what they will do is, for the very first time, because they're losing jobs, because as the businesses hit the contraction, they use it to break their unions, just dump the laborers. They dump the laborers and say, we'll hire people back at the rate we want to hire them back at. These men get together and we have the very first March on Washington. It starts in Ohio and will march its way across country. And these are people who are willing to work, but they can't find any jobs. They just start marching, looking along the way, but they're going to Washington to demand to be heard by their government. And they will find their way walking. They will find their way catching freight trains. They will find their way any way they can. And in the process, they're following one man. And it's Jacob Coxey. And, they call it Cox's Army. And it's the original protest march. He's not asking for money or handouts. He wants government to try to help them find jobs. Now, arriving in Washington, he and his supporters demand the federal government immediately assist them by hiring them to do, what an outlandish thought, public projects such as roads and government buildings. That's just unheard of. And Cleveland goes, I've looked through all this. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution. And I don't believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering. He was one of those guys who called it as he saw it, and had some concern, but, he had done very well during those 4 years he was out of the presidency. He'd made a lot of money practicing corporate law, and corporations, really don't feel that it's their job to give you a job. Yet by the same token, let's remember those limits that he said he could not find, for individuals. Funny, businesses successfully petition the government every day with their demands. Businesses are at the Capitol every day listing out everything that they need for their business to be successful and getting it. Now, industrialization had grown on into those huge trusts that we saw. They changed America incredibly. And as their trusts grew, the individual income grew, but not for the workers. Remember what Carnegie said, it's not the guy who's doing the work that becomes rich. Carnegie, though, was conscious of that and had created a model town for his workers for one of his bigger plants. And it had been a very successful business. But, Carnegie is getting, he had had an agreement that their pay was joined to his profits. So if things went up, their money went up. If things went down, their money went down. Now, the problem, people were willing to go with that, but Carnegie, is kind of getting distracted. He's been at this long enough. He's made so much money. And, he goes back to the old country. He wants to go home to Scotland because he wants to be a Scottish lord. And he turns over the homestead factory and business to a guy who had worked under him throughout, who had always been very decent, and puts Henry Frick in control. But the strikers compromise, Frick decides, it's not enough. He locks them out and fires them all. He brings in Pinkerton agents to rout them off the property. And of course, all hell breaks loose. That's just the reality. These people are fighting for their lives and their jobs. And in doing so, many would die, but they will actually storm the area, overtake the strike breakers, and they will work their way into the place. They will take over. And they realize in doing so that what they found for strike breakers are all the African Americans that Frick has brought up from the South. And that brings another level to this, which had not been seen in the North, which is a very racial level. Now, what will happen is many people will be wounded by gunfire. I don't think anybody dies in those battles, although some will die from the strike breakers, the Pinkerton men that had come in. However, they do take control. The workers will triumph, but they agree to surrender because they know the state forces are coming. It's just they're a long ways away, so it took them longer. In doing so, they agree to back off, but since they're in command, unbeknownst to them, an anarchist had joined them to get entry into the planter union because he believes in Moist's concept that you've got to kill the great men to be able to augment change. And his name is Alexander Berkman. He's the lover or perhaps husband of somebody named Emma Goldman. His goal is to kill the man, but also thus become an international martyr fostering change. And his wife, continues to advocate that the only advance for people that is possible is through change, and change is only going to happen with violence. Again, this is the person, I say wife, but I think it's just lover. They will continue to advocate this. They had moved from socialism to anarchist because of that Haymarket riot. And, the issue, we today are very conscious of the idea of radicalizing somebody. And this is what happens. That ripples down the path of life. Now, she had actually also been, she had been Moist's lover. She had been, she worked through this entire process as she's understanding and gaining knowledge of how this radicalization works. And she's one of those who will write articles and write essays and everything else. And one of the things she wrote, people only have as much liberty as they have the intelligence to want and the courage to take. Now, on the other hand, one of her other statements might be a little more straight. If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. And that always reminds me of 1776 with John Adams discussing how obnoxious and disliked he is and going through the litany, and his wife keeps going, "Oh, that's not true, John. Oh, that's not true." And he finally gets down, "Well, I'm obnoxious and disliked." And she goes, "Well, you got me there, John." And I always see this, if it really changed anything, they'd make it illegal. And my point is, remember what I said, people lose faith in the process if it cannot fix the problems. And as that depression deepened, the Democrats are going to split. The traditionalists and the Free Silver Group are fighting for the continued use of silver. They had tried it. It was just an easy out. It just put more money in the process, but it was inflationary money. It did not fix the problem of the economy, and it didn't make anybody any more money, but it was good for the Western farmers. It put cash there because remember, a lot of times they're working on barter and everything. They're not like the factories where there's actual, hard money involved. The point is the drama is real here, whether even though these issues are not going to fix it all, neither side realizes that. And it's a knockdown, drag out fight as to who's going to take control of the Democratic Party. But at the exact same time, things are worsening. And all of these businesses are using it as an excuse to tighten their belts and, if possible, get rid of unions and deals that they had made with those unions and replace people with cheaper labor. In 1894, the railroads then would cut pay to 30% by 30%. They fired all their Pullman porters and then they rehire them as cheaper labor. And I wish I could say that was a tactic that had gone out of favor, but you still see it today. It's not as blatant and there's more laws around it, but it still happens. And when this happens, a new union boycotted the Pullman cars. They blocked them in the rail yard. They would not let them move. The railroads sought an injunction saying that you're preventing, our freedom of contract. And what happens is the strike leaders are hunted down and jailed. But in doing so, that's not enough. The spark is lit quite literally, and there will be, even though you've got the state militia, even though you've got the National Guard for that state protecting the rail yards, it's not going to be enough. There will be a fight. And remember what I've always said, the Army always comes in on the side of the business owner, and Cleveland lets it be known he will send in the Army based on the fact that they're holding up the mail. That's the excuse. So from the railroads to the rise of mass factories, workers were starting to strike more and more during this. Police and Army are always there. And with that, what happens is the courts, still on the side of the owners, start also doing things that will radicalize people. One of those leaders is Eugene Debs, very intelligent man, a Democrat who had worked his way up in the rail business. He did not go into management because, of course, he wasn't born into management. And he's a labor leader. And he becomes arrested during this strike for being one of the ones who are exhorting the people to, hold the line, to stay with the strike. The courts will uphold his conviction on the ground that he was interfering with the mail and interstate commerce. He's going to go to prison for 6 months. And he always said he went to jail as a Democrat. He came out 6 months later as a socialist. And as I said, I try to give you their words. I'm opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. That was Eugene Debs. And his message, his writings, but especially his speeches will resonate. He's not really being that radical in our world today, perhaps, but at that time, that is an exceedingly radical statement. Now, remember, I said the Democratic Party is split, and you've got Grover Cleveland over here saying, I will not introduce the Inflationary Silver Act. The concept of this silver is ridiculous. It does not work. It won't do what you say it will. And he's going to fight it. And it's an ugly, brutal inter-party fight, but Cleveland wins. Well, he gets his way. I don't think anybody won. Because remember, this is that case of the stabbed in the back, but he was right. It was not going to be a fix. It was not going to fix the economy. Yet the common worker does not see it that way. To the common worker, Grover Cleveland and, Congress in general has deserted them. They're looking at that outside party. Remember, all of this is happening at the exact same time that in America, you remember last time I said, cyclically, we have a rejuvenation of things happening all the time. One of those things that constantly rolls through is the rebirth of religion. Now, at this exact same time, we have the Chautauqua, which is an era when entertainment goes from town to town. And it's entertainment, it's education, it's speakers. They go from all these rural towns. They will debate, they will declaim, they will speak, and they're very persuasive. And in doing so, they're educating the public on certain levels, whether it's religion, whether it's about some science, because of course science has become a big thing. And just as the anti-labor people had been using religion to buttress their claims, now this combination of education, religion, and politics is going to be directed at populists, because these people in these rural areas are hurting. And one of those bigger items, remember, religion had said that by the sweat of your brow, you shall earn your daily bread. Unless you're the business owner, then it's okay that you make it off somebody else's sweat. That part wasn't in the Bible, just that first part. One of the big speakers was a Mary Elizabeth Lease. She's out of Kansas. She would speak about the vast conspiracy of business, government, capitalism, the refusal of silver that would have saved rural people. And all of that is, these people are working together to keep farmers and rural people poor. We don't have anybody today that goes around coming up with these big conspiracy theories or anything, right? We don't have anybody today doing that. Well, there are other speakers. And one of those speakers is a guy named William Jennings Bryan. And he, of course, is 100% behind silver. And silver's just been denied. Remember, that fight's not going to die. These people are saying, no, we're going to take this to the election. We're going to get all of our people elected. We're going to make this happen. And thus what happens is the election will become between McKinley, the McKinley Act had brought forth terrible times, but it also brings forth William Jennings Bryan as a defender of silver, mainly because they are from the West and rural Westerners are demanding it. And William Jennings Bryan will set the convention, the Democratic Convention, on fire in 1896. And, with a speech that says, if the farms exist, but your cities do not, if something happens to them, as long as we exist, your cities will return. But if you plow us under, your cities will never return. There'll be tumbleweeds within months in your downtowns, because you have to have the worker, you have to have the farmer. And in doing so, he's saying, but we are being, enslaved by gold. And his wrap up, of course, is the famous, you shall not push down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on this cross of gold. And the people in the seats, this man was not on anybody's radar as being their nominee. They will hit their feet, they will put him on their shoulders, and they will carry him around the arena. It looks like the Democrats and progressives have joined together. They've turned away from Cleveland. They have turned away from the standard. They're going behind silver. They nominate William Jennings Bryan on a platform that is almost precisely the opposite of the Republican Party. The campaign of 1896 then is going to change many things, but one can suspect it would also change government's idea of what it owes laborers. And that becomes the big issue. McKinley and Bryan's campaign, you have the youngest man ever nominated, barely above the age limit, taking on McKinley. And McKinley had been lucky enough that after he had passed that terrible tariff that caused the 1892-93 downturn, he had gotten in 1890, he had gotten gerrymandered out of his seat and thus was not in Congress. Thus, he could just ignore any part he had had in it while he was out of office. The two of them then know how power works. But of course, McKinley has been in government, has friends, knows how to make things happen. And this is also the case where we will see the magazines and everybody else who looks at a guy that talks and talks and talks, and sees government as the way to change everything, and the guy that, doesn't talk and just says, we have to stay the course. We have to make things right. McKinley obviously is going to be backed by the business community. He's got the money and he is marketed like patent medicine. And then we see his front porch because he is not going to go campaign. At that era, people didn't campaign. You might give a speech if somebody shows up. And his home's in Canton, Ohio. He gives the front porch where he sits there, and when people show up every day, he gives the same old speech. And of course, in doing so, that speech is about strong business, hard money, and that's the platform he's going to campaign on. The Republicans will stay united, and McKinley will win that presidency in 1896, even though William Jennings Bryan does something unheard of. He goes to the public. He moves out on the railroads, and just every time the railroad stops, he gives a speech to people who show up. It will change how the presidency battles are waged in the future. But the key is the dominant forces in American life in the last quarter of the 19th century are economic and social. They're not political. These aren't about making deals. There's plenty of deals being made. It's just that the deal that needs to be made is not on the table. You cannot do anything that's going to rein in business and how they treat their people and how they provide jobs and how they pay them. Thus, we have an ineffectiveness of political leadership. They're not taking on that issue. Nobody is tackling that. Maybe had Bryant won the election, maybe he would have, maybe he wouldn't have. But we had the change from the agrarian to the big businesses. And with that, we are now looking at a situation where our politicians are all colorful personalities, but they gain their following based on a personal basis. I like this person rather than the realistic choices for political action that they're offering. At that same time, we're seeing more and more of these people because magazine and newspapers are becoming a source that's reporting all of this to us. And newspapers are firmly entrenched in America by 1900. They have no competition except each other. And there's a lot of competition between each other. I mean, it's as crazy as if we had 2 24, maybe 3 24-hour news stations all battling each other. You don't think any of them would make up a news story to get more viewers, do you? Well, actually, that's exactly what was happening in the newspapers, and most of them are clustered around those big cities that I said had been doubling and quadrupling in size. They have competing daily newspapers. And when I say daily, remember that usually meant a morning and a night. So they had 24-hour news twice a day. Now, what they actually do, at least, is exaggeration. The competition for readers would drive exaggerated stories, most of which were untrue. And that style of story is going to become known as yellow journalism. But what it really also is journalism that's making a point. They're making a claim. And you'll see that in the things that you don't even have to have somebody read. You can see Uncle Sam stands up for Cuban liberty. You might not be able to read that, but it's Cuba Liberté on the hat. And of course, Uncle Sam is standing on Cuba. Cuba has long been viewed as our island. We just didn't take it because, of course, the problem with taking Cuba, notice the color of the people who lived there. America really wasn't. It's the whole reason that, honestly, we did not take all of Mexico when we had defeated them. We weren't ready to be to have a state where the majority of the people were not, the same color as everyone else. So what's happening is the crisis of Cuba is growing and growing. And remember that they will send a ship down there to protect interests, and that's the Maine, and the Maine will be destroyed in the harbor. And there's always that question, was it Spanish treachery? Crisis at hand, Spanish treachery. Oh, in small print is cabinet in session and growing belief in Spanish treachery. The newspapers have begun a drumbeat. The Maine was destroyed, outside attack, naval officers believe, censored dispatchers say a shot was heard before the ship's magazine blew up. Extra, McKinley suspicious of Spanish plots. They're doing it to sell papers. The destruction of the Maine was the work of an enemy. And we'll give you $50,000 if you can help us prove that. That sounds pretty familiar today, doesn't it? Somebody just had to cough up the 5 million for saying, anyway. President McKinley is being pushed by both sides. We have to go to war. We have to go to war. And of course, he's annoying a lot of people because he's saying, I'm waiting for, the investigating committee to tell me what it is. But Congress is demanding war, and McKinley, of course, being a smart political operative, says, really, I don't have to make a choice. He turns the issue over to Congress. You're the ones who declare war. If you vote for it, I'm not going to deny it. It is your choice, and he does so. And of course, Congress does declare war. Now, here's the thing we need to remember. I've been saying that this progressive movement is moving ahead. War changes everything, but one of the biggest things that war does is it will stop the progressive movement. No matter what progressive movement is afoot, it will at least delay it, because when war comes, it's always back to your home base, focus just on this war. So across history, we see this over and over again. But the positive thing here is the Spanish War, was a very short one. Now, of course, the war in the Philippines, the Spanish were defeated immediately in the Philippines, but the war with the people of the Philippines will go on for years. But that becomes a quiet war, not one that is in the headlines much. Now, by winning the Spanish-American War, McKinley has not only put America on the world stage, but he's also now able to choose his own path. He is now a hero. He's able to do whatever he thinks is right. He will defeat William Jennings Bryan soundly, because William Jennings Bryan is saying, what you've done with Hawaii and what you've done with the Philippines, that strikes me as empire. We immediately say we're not keeping Cuba, but to keep the Philippines and to keep Hawaii, you're making us colonialists. This is an empire you're creating. Well, the American public doesn't want to hear that. They're more than happy. Remember that strong man theory. Hey, he did something, he made a decision, we're going with it. That's great. But it is a change, major change in American history, but we don't even notice it. We go over it. It's not even a speed bump. War changes everything, and winning a war changes everything greatly. Things that were impossible to conceive happen like that, kind of like the Patriot Act getting passed after 9/11. Cooler heads might have looked at that and said, that's a lot of rights to give away. Not after a successful war. Boom. Having achieved very much in his first term, McKinley will set a higher goal in his second, much higher than he had. He's championing two new ideas: the control of trusts, actually cracking down on businesses, and to stimulate foreign trade, to take tariffs off. He's realizing now that we're on the world stage, we want to sell more, and tariffs make that difficult. He will hit the road and travel the country to speak of these new goals. And he's ending up at the beginning of September in Buffalo, New York in 1901. And at Buffalo, New York, McKinley is assassinated by Leon Kosley, an anarchist, an avowed anarchist who believes in Moyse's dictum that says, you kill the great man, you can do many, many great things, and is willing to be that martyr. Now, Emma Goldman, who's still around, sheds no false tears. Never before in the history of governments has the sound of a pistol shot so startled, terrorized, and horrified the self-satisfied, indifferent, contented, and indolent public as has the one fired by Leon when he struck down William McKinley, president of the money kings and the trust magnates of the country. She goes on to say a lot more, most of which is not, this was the nice part that I could read. And in doing so, remember, she has positioned herself exactly as those speakers did at the Haymarket that had created the event that had created her. She will end up charged as a conspiracy to murder because Leon says, I was greatly influenced by the writing of Emma Goldman. She's held without bail, and yet she will continue to spout things that just continue to infuriate everybody. As I said, like the event that created her, again, though, first of all, we are 15 years down the road since that last occurrence. Secondly, again, she is a female, and the idea of putting a woman on trial for a capital crime when really they did not pull the trigger, nor were they involved in it, might be a stretch for a jury. So what they will do is she and 3 others will be exiled, and they'll be exiled to Russia, since they seem to like the idea of so many of these foreign intrigues. She and the other people are being exiled to a place they've never lived, never known. And in doing so, find they won't have much of a life there. One of them, will think he has the ability to criticize what's happening there, and he'll end up dying in a gulag. But Emma will be around and probably be back before we know it here. But these things come around. Now, one of the things that does come around, newspapers have realized what they did was very powerful in the Spanish-American War, but also very dangerous. And new reporters are finding magazines and newspapers that let them tell the stories that will make a change. And they're finding the editors, like Joseph Pulitzer, who want to make positive changes. And they focus on new types of stories. And their favorite targets are social ills, corporate monopolies, crooked politics. And of course, it's these stories that will change America coming forward. We already heard about Ida Tarbell and the history of Standard Oil and the impact she has both on Rockefeller himself and on the destruction of the large trust that was Standard Oil. Lincoln Steffes, The Shame of Cities, talking about what's happening with these machine politics and with the slums and everything else. Upton Sinclair, of course, is going to write the one that will make the biggest change, and that's The Jungle, in which he is looking at what happens with young immigrants who will end up working in the packing plants and not being able to make nearly enough money, the women being forced into prostitution, things like that. All of those things will be huge. But of course, what actually happens is, as Upton Sinclair says, his book, The Jungle, made a huge difference, but he was aiming at the concept of the inequities of the immigration system and how bad, the workers are served. Instead, what the people take out of it is all of the disgusting things happening in these packing plants where these immigrants are working that are listed out ad infinitum by Sinclair. And as he said, I was aiming at people's hearts. I wanted them to feel kindly toward these immigrants. That didn't happen at all. I hit America in the stomach by seeing all the terrible things that was happening to the food in these packing plants and the disgusting things that were going into their sausage and everything else. but they are able to make a difference. And Joseph Pulitzer, of course, is a name that still lives today. He left funds when he died to establish the first school of journalism at Columbia University. J schools then abound. The idea is to recognize good writing, to reward good writing and stimulate good writing. And they will continue to do so and are still felt yet today. And remember, we had another battle between, within a party. You have Teddy Roosevelt and his chosen successor, Taft, will square off, each to be the progressive giant. Taft, of course, is saying, hey, I stayed out of everybody's business. We kept government out of your business and out of your personal life. And of course, Roosevelt saying, you did not do enough to make life better for people. You remember Roosevelt's the guy who had the square deal, Teddy Roosevelt, that everybody, government should be able to help people. They fight it out. And in doing so, they open the door to Wilson. And of course, Wilson will come in and produce most of the progressive legislation that was in that plan, all the planks that we saw in 1892 for the Progressive Party. He gets those passed along with work, refinement of work and things like that. Now, they're going to end up where the Supreme Court is going to again give them grief, but they passed most of it, and most of it stands. But again, remember what I said, the progressive era always ends, when war comes along. And there is not only a war, but a great war that is snaking across the continent of Europe. And no war has ever changed so much. Maps, technology, methods, ideas, all of them change. And we see massive change. And of course, it is this change that will cause Russia to drop out of the war, and eventually the fall of the Tsar and the rise of actual communism. So the fears of those businesses are suddenly realized in the fact that the common people of an entire country have risen up and taken those businesses away from the owners. That fear of socialism that they always had suddenly has a real face. Now, again, Wilson achieved many progressive measures, but that phase is now going to stall and stay stalled for another decade. In doing so, remember also at the end of war, during wars, workers are always incented by patriotism to just do more work, supply the bullets, supply the weaponry needed, being told that after that war, they will be rewarded. And of course, what then happens is nothing changes and strikes will come. And with those strikes, violence comes. And we see that same repetition yet again, that same issue that the armies and the police will come forward, and the idea that anybody who's striking must now be one of those Reds that we saw in Russia. They must want to overthrow capitalism in America. And remember that cycle that I said would happen? They will bust up the labor areas, they will designate anybody as an anarchist, and they will deport them. There are no search warrants, there's no deportation hearings, they are just sent out. And as an interesting side, during the war, at a labor rally, Eugene Debs, who remember has a record, was warned that you cannot speak out against the war. There was a fear that he would prevent people from signing up for the war. And at a labor rally in Cleveland, he denounces both sides, the Allies and the Germans, saying they're seeking profits at home and plunder abroad. The master class has always taught you it is your patriotic duty to go to war and have yourself slaughtered. He's taken to court saying that he violated the agreements of his parole, and he is going to, by unanimous decision, send him to jail, this time for 10 years for contempt of court for violating the court order not to speak. But remember, as the 1920s are entering, there's still those inequities, there are still problems. And the very first terrorist act on American soil happens. And it does seem like we're at war. The wagon blows up on Wall Street. It will kill 29 people, injure over 200. It's targeting supposedly J.P. Morgan, and the richest man then, in business. And the reaction is, again, all the same: round up all the foreign-born agitators, exile or imprison them. Eugene Debs is lucky; he's already in prison. Also, I'm not sure that he's foreign-born, so he does not get painted by that. See, that's the thing: if they're foreign-born, you can do things that might not be legal if the person's an American citizen. But Debs is not finished. He's already in prison, but he will run for president, as he already had, I think, in 2012 or 1912, and he will receive almost 1 million votes as a presidential candidate while sitting in jail. So with that, we come to the end of tonight's program. The things we saw that are like last week: we have an increasing population base, an expanding ability to communicate, an increase in some disinformation that starts leading people, differences of opinion. The big time now is between rural and urban, and there's not an engagement between those two sides. They simply savage each other, and in doing so, that leads to a lack of respect for the opinions of others. What we also saw was exactly like before the Civil War. You can't achieve your goals via political solution. Then what happens if you feel you're not heard? And unfortunately, we know what happens. And that process then will also radicalize others. So tonight, did you learn anything? Is this what you were hoping to hear about? Remember, in the Frances Perkins talk, I said, why don't we know about Frances Perkins? Why don't we know about the things she did? It's because in America, we do not study labor history. It's too sensitive. So with that, that's what the story I had hoped to tell. It is a time when we the people's vote was greatly discounted. It did not lead to a shooting war, but there were some explosions. Remember, in the West, it was all about the mines. In the West, it's Big Bill Haywood, and it's the guys behind silver and coal. Those are the big issues, but they're doing much the same thing. Out there, there's a lot more head busting, not as much arrests and exile as there is arrests and convictions. So next week, we're going to see the other side of the coin for these years. Same years, different focus. We're going to be looking at what happens on the other side that we rarely look at all: issues of race and civil rights through this same time period. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. This would be a great time to unmute. Prove to me you're all still there. I hope it's a program you wanted to hear, and I hope you'll all be back next week. So, wow. So, hi, Lois. Anybody? Any comments? Anything you'd like to say? Feel free to unmute, and this is our chance to talk, but otherwise you're also free to go. It's been a long night. I did get it in though. I got it in within the time frame. I just want you to know that, okay?
You
I'm always
certainly
proud of it.
did. Thank
Hey,
you.
Russ, there's some in the chat too.
Yep, I did see a text here, and Sandy, thank you. It says very interesting. I really enjoyed the refreshing information on so many people I hadn't heard or thought about in years. And the issue of Eugene Debs came up in a conversation with me a while back because somebody was saying something about if convicted, blah, blah. I said, well, you can run for president sitting in prison. Yeah, it is possible, and it's been done before. So, so, all right. Anybody have any comments, questions, thoughts?
Russ, I'm looking forward to-
It doesn't seem much like we learn too much nowadays.
That is a that is a scary thought, isn't it? History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So,
Right.
yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
Like her, I found myself thinking about that first line in A Tale of Two Cities, a time so very like the present.
Yeah. So very like. Yeah. Interesting. And again, why no shooting war? Regionalism. While there was West versus East, there's still farmers in the East as well. It was not as clearly defined as North and South. But the big issue is if you really look at it, this is what happens when the political parties do not meet the expectations of the people. The people see their job as doing something for them. And if they don't, there is hell to pay.
Well, too many of the politicians were bought and paid for, and not necessarily by the people that elected them.
Not necessarily. Okay. Well, I am certainly here.
Russ,
Yes.
you told us that you shouldn't diminish or make fun of the opposition. And maybe I heard that in a different way in Vietnam. Before we went there, they taught us not to underestimate the capabilities of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. And that was a wise statement then, and it's a wise statement here as well. Think about it in both cases. Big business, will pay a price for not valuing the people. So, but with that, I hope this sheds some light on a time that most Americans know nothing about. You've heard me joke about it before. That last quarter to last half of the 19th century is that case of the bearded wonders, as in you look at the pictures of the president and wonder who that bearded guy is, because none of them stood out. And hopefully now you see partially why they didn't stand out. But you also see the limitations, but the changes that were happening too. And they're changes that then will reverberate, first with Teddy Roosevelt, then with Wilson, who actually says, I'm going to be the prime minister. I am going to bring bills to the Senate and the House, tell them what I want passed and get them passed, and did. Huge change. And of course, that's very much the life we live in today, right? So, okay. We can see how things are moving toward where we are today. Hopefully, we might get something out of this that we can see how to better live today, to try to look. Remember, in the leadership series that we've done, we've always said you really need to evaluate not just what you see as the problem, but really what is the root problem, and then be able to move people toward a solution to that problem. All of these guys through all of this, they're only dealing with the symptoms. That entire concept of the Silver Act and everything else, the reason none of that made sense to you when you were listening to it as a kid in high school or college studying history, it didn't make any sense because it wasn't going to do anything anyway. It didn't make sense. That's the problem. You know, but it was the easy fix to say, look, I'm doing something for you. No, you're not. And what you're doing is not going to improve things. So all big things. Folks, it is up to our limit. I think I should let you go as long as you all promise you're coming back next week. Is that a
I'm
deal?
looking forward to next week.
All right. Thank you. I hope
Sounds
you'll.
good, yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye, bye.
Have a good
Night.
night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Russ. Good night.
Thank you. Hope this all worked for all of you.
Night.
Good night. Thanks, Sue. Thank you for all your help.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.